The invasion of Helghan and the landing of the ISA fleet on the red dust surface introduces the lore of the solar reckoning of the colonial vengeance. 2 years after the defense of Vekta, the ISA has transitioned from victim to aggressor, launching a massive counterstrike to capture Scholar Visari and end the Helghast threat, representing the imperial sovereignty of the retaliation. The lore suggests that the Earth-backed ISA is no longer defending liberty, but exporting the violence to the source of the infection, representing the aggressive sovereignty of the UCN. For Sergeant Savchenko and Alpha Squad, the landing at Pyrrhus is the lore of the atmospheric hostility of the exile. They find that the air itself is a weapon filled with corrosive dust and static storms that turn the Vektan equipment into useless steel. This is the lore of the Red Purgatory, where the soldier becomes the sacrament of the environmental submission. The lore of the Pyrrhus city siege provides the lore of the urban fortress of the fanaticism. Pyrrhus, the capital of Helghan, is not built for living, but for defiance, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Scholar Visari. The lore suggests that every window is a sniper nest and every basement is a munitions factory, representing the totalitarian sovereignty of the architecture. This is the lore of the meat grinder of the ideology. It suggests that the Helghast have turned their trauma into a structural weapon. This represents the defensive sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Pyrrhus streets is the lore of the geometric death. You must clear the room to claim the dirt, proving that your sovereignty is tactical and exhausting, turning the industrial ruins into a sacrament of the attrition, where the hero is boiled by the red light. The introduction of the Petrosite energy introduces the lore of the volatile sovereignty of the Helghan soil. Petrosite, a highly unstable and glowing blue mineral found deep within the planet, serves as the lifeblood of the Helghast war machine, representing the resource sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that Visari has weaponized the planet's core to compensate for the lack of the allies, representing the scientific sovereignty of the survival. This is the lore of the blue fire. It suggests that energy is violent and unpredictable. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Helghan. The lore of the Petrosite cells is the lore of the lightning in the bottle. It powers the arc towers to shatter the ISA tanks, proving that your sovereignty is biochemical. This highlights the electric nature of the conflict, turning the power plant raid into a sacrament of the electrocution. The lore of the Helghast arc towers provides the lore of the defensive lightning of the autocracy. These massive, obsidian-like spires act as a shield of the static, striking down any ISA aircraft that enters the city's airspace, representing the orbital sovereignty of the denial. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not need a fleet when they own the clouds, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the Lente's successors. This is the lore of the thunder of the Visari. It suggests that entry is a death sentence written in the voltage. This represents the technological sovereignty of the defense. The lore of the Arc Tower sabotage is the lore of the grounding of the god. You must climb the spire to silence the storm, proving that your sovereignty is mechanical. This highlights the verticality of the siege, turning the upper walkways into a sacrament of the gravity. The presence of the Helghast Radic Academy provides the lore of the educational militarization of the hate. This facility, used to brainwash the conscripts into elites, represents the pedagogical sovereignty of the state. The lore suggests that the Helghast are made in the classroom before they are armed in the barracks, representing the psychological sovereignty of the indoctrination. This is the lore of the Temple of the War. It suggests that intellect is a tool of the slaughter. This represents the academic sovereignty of the Colonel Male Radic. The lore of the Academy breach is the lore of the desecration of the faith. You find the statues of the Visari and the books of the hatred, proving that your sovereignty is iconoclastic. This highlights the cult-like nature of the enemy, turning the Grand Hall combat into a sacrament of the profane. The lore of the Tharsis refinery provides the lore of the industrialized desperation of the colony. As the ISA pushes toward the source of the Helghast fuel, the lore reveals that the planet is being eaten to kill the invader, representing the suicidal sovereignty of the resource management. The lore suggests that Helghan is a suicide note written in the smoke and the oil, representing the economic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the burning horizon. It suggests that victory for the Helghast is worth the death of the world. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the industry. The lore of the refinery siege is the lore of the heart of the furnace. It chokes the Sev with the fumes of the ambition, proving that your sovereignty is respirational. This highlights the suffocating nature of the war, turning the catwalk firefights into a sacrament of the asphyxiation. For the Sev of the landing era, the world is the testing of the gritty resolve. You realize that the world is trying to kill you. The lore suggests that Sev is the logic in the red dust. You are the only mind that coordinates the Alpha to survive the siege. The city is not an objective. It is a mechanical trap that you must disarm with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the loading of the magazine so methodical. You are becoming the storm to stop the storm. You look at the lightning of the Arc Towers, knowing that it is the only light that the Visari has left to blind the justice. The Golden Age is a silence on the landing craft, and you are the only will left to lead the charge into the maw of the Helghan. As this first segment of the history concludes, Sev stands at the edge of the Pyrrhus district, the red dust swirling around his goggles. Behind lies the imperial sovereignty of the retaliation. Before stands the siege of the academy and the arrival of the Colonel Radek. The air is no longer tense with the anticipation, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the blood. You have seen the hostility of the exile, the volatile sovereignty of the Petricite, and the defensive lightning of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the strategy of the invasion to the sovereignty of the survival. You realize that the invader is now the hunted. You look at the dark skyline, knowing that you are finally the first bullet in the heart of the Visari. The Golden Age is a blue spark in a red world, and you are the only hand left to shatter the crown of the Helghan. The sabotage of the Tharsis refinery and the extraction of the Petricite core introduces the lore of the industrialized martyrdom of the Helghan energy. As Sev and Rico descend into the heart of the processing plant, the environment represents the volatile sovereignty of the resource extraction. The lore suggests that the refinery is not just a factory, but the circulatory system of the Helghast defense, pumping the blue Petricite energy into the city's weapons, representing the metabolic sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the heart of the furnace. They find that the heat is a weaponized byproduct, used to cook the invader in the narrow catwalks. This is the lore of the mechanical hell, where the soldier must boil the blood to silence the machines, turning the refinery catwalks into a sacrament of the evaporation. The tactical genius of Colonel Mail Radek provides the lore of the aristocratic coldness of the executioner. Radek, the leader of the Helghast Special Forces and the Visari's right hand, represents the lethal sovereignty of the military discipline. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the professional slaughter. He does not shout propaganda. He delivers results with surgical precision, representing the cold sovereignty of the autocracy. This is the lore of the shadow of the general. It suggests that efficiency is the only virtue in the Helghan culture. This represents the elite sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Radek's ambush is the lore of the chessboard of the dead. He allows the ISA to advance only to cut their supply lines, proving that your sovereignty is reactive and vulnerable, turning the industrial zones into a sacrament of the masterclass strategy. The first true defeat of the ISA ground forces at the Soljiva village provides the lore of the crushing reality of the overextension. As the ISA armor divisions are liquidated by the Helghast heavy units and hidden at turrets, it represents the strategic sovereignty of the home turf advantage. The lore suggests that the ISA arrived with arrogance, believing that superior technology would shatter the Helghan will, only to find that will is the hardest armor, representing the psychological sovereignty of the resistance. This is the lore of the retreat of the sun. It suggests that conquest is a heavy weight that crushes the weak. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the defiance. The lore of the Soljiva massacre is the lore of the end of the momentum, turning the Vektan morale into a sacrament of the despair. The lore of the Helghast heavy shock troopers introduces the lore of the physical apex of the dehumanized war. These massive soldiers, encased in blast-proof ceramics and wielding petrocite-driven chain guns, represent the ballistic sovereignty of the Helghan industry. Their lore suggests that the Helghan atmosphere has thickened their muscles, while the state has hardened their hearts, representing the biological sovereignty of the mutation. This is the lore of the walking fortress. It suggests that fear is a calculated variable. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the soldier. The lore of the heavy encounter is the lore of the wall of the lead. You must use the explosives to reach the man, proving that your sovereignty is destructive. This highlights the gritty nature of the combat, turning the Soljiva streets into a sacrament of the meat. The lore of the blood-freezing Helghan climate provides the lore of the atmospheric sovereignty of the exclusion zone. Throughout the wastes, the sub-zero dust storms and the static discharge represent the meteorological sovereignty of the Helghan. The lore suggests that the planet is rejecting the ISA like a biological virus, representing the ecological sovereignty of the exile. This is the lore of the red frost. It suggests that survival is not guaranteed by the gear. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the storm navigation is the lore of the blind man's war. It forces the Sev to rely on the sound of the enemy's breathing, proving that your sovereignty is primitive. This highlights the suffocating nature of the planet, turning the wasteland trek into a sacrament of the sensory deprivation. The presence of the propaganda towers in the Soljiva wastes introduces the lore of the mental sovereignty of the invisible leader. Even in the remote mining villages, the voice of the Visari echoes from the loudspeakers, representing the ubiquitous sovereignty of the autarch. The lore suggests that Visari is omnipresent, a god of the red sky, who watches the sin of the invader, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the eyes of the Helghan. It suggests that truth is what the speaker commands. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the tower sabotage is the lore of the muting of the god. You must cut the power to stop the lies, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the mining outpost into a sacrament of the iconoclasm. For the Sev of the Soljiva era, the world is the testing of the tactical desperation. You realize that the world is winning the war. The lore suggests that Sev is the last bastion of the ISA morale. You are the only mind that sees the flaw in the Radix pattern. The village is not a place. It is a kill zone of the history that you must survive with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the saving of Rico so brutal. You are clinging to the squad while the army falls apart. You look at the red horizon, knowing that it is the only grave that the Visari has left to dig for the Vekta. The Golden Age is a misfire in the cold, and you are the only spark left to ignite the resistance against the Radix. As this second segment of the history concludes, Sev stands in the smoking ruins of the Soljiva bridge, the red dust clogging his rifle. Behind lies the heart of the furnace and the defeat of the ground forces. Before stands the infiltration of the male Radix cruiser and the final ascent to the palace. The air is no longer tense with the heat, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the metal. You have seen the tactical genius of the executioner, the walking fortress of the state, and the mental sovereignty of the leader. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the survival to the sovereignty of the counterattack. You realize that the invader must become the assassin. You look at the sky, knowing that you are finally the only bullet left in the chamber. The Golden Age is a shattered shield, and you are the only sword left to pierce the heart of the Pyrrhus. The infiltration of the Helghast cruiser and the assault on the aerial command fleet introduces the lore of the vertical sovereignty of the Helghan skies. As Sev and Rico board the massive Gothic warships, the environment represents the obsidian sovereignty of the air superiority. The lore suggests that these cruisers are not just transports, but flying cathedrals of the war, designed to project the will of Visari over any planetary surface, representing the orbital sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the belly of the beast. They find that the internal security is a clockwork of the execution, where the narrow corridors are designed to funnel the invader into the crossfire of the sentry turrets. This is the lore of the pressurized purgatory, where the soldier must choke the engine to shatter the wing, turning the cruiser hangar into a sacrament of the decompression. The duel in the hangar provides the lore of the brutal sincerity of the Helghast infantry. As the squad is forced to fight through the elite guard to reach the bridge, it represents the sovereignty of the martial prowess. The lore suggests that the cruiser crew are selected for their fanaticism, representing the psychological sovereignty of the male Radic. This is the lore of the zero-gravity butcher. It suggests that loyalty is tested in the fire. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the fleet. The lore of the hangar combat is the lore of the kinetic desperation. You must use the environment to crush the armor, proving that your sovereignty is adaptive. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the boarding, turning the flight deck into a sacrament of the metal, where the hero is measured by the scars. The discovery of the final secrets of the petricite weaponry provides the lore of the radioactive sovereignty of the Helghan science. Deep within the cruiser's armory, the lore reveals the petricite grenades and arc rifles, representing the molecular sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that Visari has stolen the lightning to punish the Vekta, representing the technological sovereignty of the Revenge. This is the lore of the synthetic apocalypse. It suggests that energy is the final frontier of the hate. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the lab. The lore of the petricite weaponry is the lore of the Blue Death. It dissolves the flesh and shatters the steel, proving that your sovereignty is scientific. This highlights the unnatural nature of the conflict, turning the armory raid into a sacrament of the radiation. The lore of the Helghast commando units introduces the lore of the guerrilla sovereignty of the elite outcast. These specialized troops, equipped with cloaking technology and silent suppressors, represent the invasive sovereignty of the shadow. Their lore suggests that the Helghast have learned to hide in the smoke to bite the throat of the ISA, representing the predatory sovereignty of the Radic Academy. This is the lore of the Phantom of the Helghan. It suggests that visibility is a choice of the predator. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the assassination. The lore of the commando encounter is the lore of the sound of the blade. You must watch the static to find the man, proving that your sovereignty is perceptive. This highlights the paranoid nature of the combat, turning the service tunnels into a sacrament of the stealth. The presence of the Visari's final intercom introduces the lore of the omnipresent sovereignty of the autarch. Throughout the cruiser, the voice of the leader continues to command the dead, representing the vocal sovereignty of the indoctrination. The lore suggests that Visari does not lead an army. He controls a mind, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the ghost in the circuit. It suggests that death is irrelevant to the cause. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the intercom broadcast is the lore of the infinite echo. It infects the silence with the promise of the resurrection, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the bridge assault into a sacrament of the fanaticism, where the enemy is fighting for a god. The lore of the Suljiva mining heritage provides the lore of the economic sovereignty of the slave labor. As the squad finds the logs of the petricite extraction, the lore reveals that the Helghan people were worked to the bone to build the fleet, representing the industrial sovereignty of the sacrifice. The lore suggests that the cruiser is built of the Helghast souls, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the monument to the pain. It suggests that greatness is paid for in the blood of the weak. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the industry. The lore of the mining records is the lore of the cost of the war. It sours the victory with the reality of the slavery, proving that your sovereignty is tragic. This highlights the dark reality of the planet, turning the data retrieval into a sacrament of the guilt. For the Sev of the cruiser era, the world is the testing of the claustrophobic resolve. You realize that the world is being controlled from the sky. The lore suggests that Sev is the virus in the system. You are the only mind that understands the architecture of the failure. The cruiser is not a ship. It is a mechanical heart of the tyranny that you must stop with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the setting of the explosives so quiet. You are killing the machine to reach the man. You look at the Helghast crest on the wall, knowing that it is the only mark that the Visari has left to tattoo the sky. The golden age is a hum of the reactor, and you are the only note left to signal the end of the aerial occupation. As this third segment of the history concludes, Sev stands on the observation deck of the crashing cruiser, the Pyrrhus city rushing up to meet the steel. Behind lies the infiltration of the fleet and the secrets of the Petrosite. Before stands the siege of the Visari Palace and the final duel with male Radek. The air is no longer tense with the vacuum, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent impact. You have seen the sovereignty of the air superiority, the molecular sovereignty of the mutation, and the vocal sovereignty of the leader. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the counterattack to the sovereignty of the endgame. You realize that the god is naked. You look at the palace spire, knowing that you are finally the only storm left to break. The golden age is a burning wing in the dark, and you are the only will left to walk into the heart of the fire. The breach of the Visari Palace perimeter and the final storming of the Autarchus seat introduces the lore of the architectural sovereignty of the Helghast ego. As Sev and the remnants of the ISA forces reach the Grand Plaza, the environment represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the monumentalism. The lore suggests that the palace is not just a home, but a statement of the Helghan superiority, built with sharp, aggressive angles and massive obsidian-like slabs that dwarf the human form, representing the psychological sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the desecration of the temple. They find that the Palace Guard are the most fanatic soldiers in the history of the war, men who have sworn their blood to the Visari, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the oath. This is the lore of the Last Stand, where the soldier must trample the pride to end the nightmare, turning the palace courtyard into a sacrament of the ruin. The fall of the Helghast Guard provides the lore of the systematic liquidation of the elite. These troops, equipped with the best Petrosite shields and heavy weaponry the Helghan industry can provide, represent the industrial sovereignty of the bodyguard. The lore suggests that the guard is a human wall designed to buy Visari the time to speak, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the sacrifice. This is the lore of the dying vanguard. It suggests that loyalty is a resource that is spent until the vault is empty. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the command. The lore of the plaza combat is the lore of the meat grinder of the history. You must walk over the fallen to reach the door, proving that your sovereignty is relentless. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the breach, turning the staircases of the palace into a sacrament of the attrition. The final duel with Colonel Male Radek provides the lore of the aristocratic death of the perfectionist. Radek, choosing to fight the ISA in the grand balcony of the palace, represents the martial sovereignty of the Helghan aristocracy. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the honorable executioner. He does not hide. He teleports and assaults with an unflinching precision, representing the elite sovereignty of the academy. This is the lore of the warrior's end. It suggests that Radek is the final obstacle between the civilization and the autarch. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the duel. The lore of the Radek confrontation is the lore of the suicide of the pride. By taking his own life rather than surrendering to the ISA, Radek proves that his sovereignty is absolute and unbreakable, turning the palace balcony into a sacrament of the defiance. The lore of the Petrosite pulse defenses provides the lore of the molecular sovereignty of the palace security. Throughout the halls, the deployment of arc turrets and electrified barriers represents the energy sovereignty of the Helghast science. The lore suggests that the palace is alive with the lightning of the Helghan soil, representing the environmental sovereignty of the defense. This is the lore of the living fortress. It suggests that steel is infused with the hate. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the interior sabotage is the lore of the grounding of the power. You must shatter the crystals to open the path, proving that your sovereignty is mechanical and destructive. This highlights the electric nature of the conflict, turning the grand hallways into a sacrament of the static. The lore of the Helghast capture and the fate of the ISA generals provides the lore of the political sovereignty of the Helghan leverage. As the squad finds the interrogation chambers within the palace, the lore reveals that the ISA High Command was paralyzed by the Helghast counterintelligence, representing the cynical sovereignty of the Atom's legacy. The lore suggests that the General Templar was betrayed by the Vektan bureaucracy, representing the institutional sovereignty of the corruption. This is the lore of the betrayed hero. It suggests that war is lost in the office before it is won in the field. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the state. The lore of the palace records is the lore of the end of the Republic. It sours the advance with the reality of the treason, proving that your sovereignty is isolated. The presence of the Visari's inner sanctum introduces the lore of the theological sovereignty of the dictator. As Sev and Rico approach the final doors, the architecture becomes religious in its intensity, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the autarch. The lore suggests that Visari has turned himself into a god to give the Helghast a reason to die, representing the sociological sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the temple of the ego. It suggests that personality is the only law in the Helghan world. This represents the autocratic sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the inner sanctum is the lore of the silence of the god. It prepares the Sev for the final conversation, proving that your sovereignty is final, turning the final doors into a sacrament of the truth, where the monster is waiting to speak. For the Sev of the palace era, the world is the testing of the morale integrity. You realize that the world is defined by the one man. The lore suggests that Sev is the end of the Helghast era. You are the only bullet that targets the heart of the lie. The palace is not a building, it is a mechanical spine of the terror that you must snap with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the killing of Radek so cold. You are removing the shield to expose the sword. You look at the Helghast banners, knowing that they are the only veils that the Visari has left to hide the truth. The Golden Age is a silence in the Grand Hall, and you are the only echo left to signal the end of the Radek's pride. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, Sev stands before the great doors of the autarch, the blood of the Radek on the floor. Behind lies the fall of the Helghast guard and the duel on the balcony. Before stands the final meeting with Scholar Visari and the beginning of the Helghan Holocaust. The air is no longer tense with the battle, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the prophecy. You have seen the architectural sovereignty of the ego, the suicide of the pride, and the theological sovereignty of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the endgame to the sovereignty of the consequence. You realize that the god is waiting. You look at the door, knowing that you are finally the only executioner of the history. The Golden Age is a red light under the door, and you are the only will left to shatter the voice of the Helghan. The final conversation with Scholar Visari and the breach of the inner sanctum introduces the lore of the philosophical sovereignty of the autarch's will. As Sev and Rico confront Visari, the environment is stripped of military utility and replaced with imperial grandeur, representing the intellectual sovereignty of the state. The lore suggests that Visari is not a soldier, but a creator of a reality who has transformed the Helghast into a weapon through words alone, representing the linguistic sovereignty of the dictatorship. For Sev, this encounter is the lore of the trap of the narrative. He finds that Visari does not plead for his life. Instead, he orchestrates his own martyrdom to ensure the eternal hatred of his people against the ISA. This is the lore of the political suicide, where the monster becomes the sacrament of the unending war. The execution of the autarch by Rico Velasquez provides the lore of the emotional volatility of the ISA failure. Driven by the grief of his fallen squad and the taunts of the dictator, Rico's decision to gun down Visari represents the impulsive sovereignty of the human rage. The lore suggests that Visari won the moment the trigger was pulled, as he died a hero of the Helghan rather than a prisoner of the Vekta, representing the martyrdom sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the death of the law. It suggests that order cannot survive the chaos of the revenge. This represents the moral sovereignty of the defeat. The lore of the Visari's death is the lore of the birth of the ghost, turning the palace throne room into a sacrament of the eternal conflict, where the victory is nothing but a grave. The post-nuclear destruction of Pyrrhus and the nuclear detonation provides the lore of the scorched earth sovereignty of the Helghan. As the red dust of the city is consumed by the white light of the Helghast-triggered nuclear device, it represents the apocalyptic sovereignty of the exclusion. The lore suggests that the Helghast would rather erase their own capital than surrender its keys to the invader, representing the genocidal sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the atomic cleansing. It suggests that fire is the only way to purify the soil of the ISA presence. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the survival. The lore of the nuclear flash is the lore of the end of the Pyrrhus, turning the colonial ambition into a sacrament of the ash. The lore of the Vektan guilt and the failure of the mission provides the lore of the strategic collapse of the ISA invasion. With the fleet destroyed and the autarch dead but ascended, the ISA forces are left stranded on a radioactive rock, representing the isolated sovereignty of the marooned. The lore suggests that the invasion was a sunk-cost fallacy that led to the destruction of a generation, representing the imperial sovereignty of the hubris. This is the lore of the orphaned army. It suggests that Earth has abandoned the Vekta to the mercy of the Helghan winter. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the High Command. The lore of the failed extraction is the lore of the long walk home, proving that your sovereignty is meaningless in the presence of the void. The presence of the stall arms and the rise of the new leaders introduces the lore of the corporate sovereignty of the post-Visari era. As the power vacuum opens, the lore reveals the shadow players like Joran Stahl, who represent the technological sovereignty of the arms race. The lore suggests that Visari was the face, but Stahl is the engine that will rebuild the hate, representing the economic sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the rebirth of the industry. It suggests that ideology is powered by the prophets. This represents the mercenary sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Stahl rise is the lore of the endless cycle. It infects the future with the promise of a better weapon, proving that your sovereignty is tactical but not structural. The lore of the Sev's thousand-yard stare provides the lore of the psychological dissolution of the hero. Sitting on the palace steps as the sky falls, Sev's silence represents the catatonic sovereignty of the disillusionment. The lore suggests that the soldier has seen the end of the world and realized that he helped to light the match, representing the moral sovereignty of the accountability. This is the lore of the shell-shocked savior. It suggests that sanity is the first casualty of the Helghan soil. This represents the humanistic sovereignty of the trauma. The lore of the final scene is the lore of the silence of the god. It removes the hope from the victory, turning the credits into a sacrament of the despair, where the protagonist is lost in the red. For the Sev of the final part, the world is the testing of the nihilistic resolve. You realize that the world is dead because of you. The lore suggests that Sev is the witness to the apocalypse. You are the only mind that understands that the Visari won the war. The palace is not a building, it is a mechanical tombstone for the humanity that you must accept with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the looking at the horizon so heavy. You are watching the sun go out. You look at the Rico, knowing that his rage has signed the death warrant for the rest of the fleet. The Golden Age is a mushroom cloud over the Pyrrhus, and you are the only will left to sit in the ash and wait for the end. As this fifth and final segment of the history concludes, Sev sits on the steps of the burning palace, the Helghast fleet beginning to scream across the sky. Behind lies the execution of the autarch. Before stands the guerrilla war of Killzone 3 and the infinite struggle for the survival. The air is no longer tense with the battle, but cold with the certainty of the doom. You have seen the philosophical sovereignty of the will, the impulsive sovereignty of the rage, and the post-nuclear destruction of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the endgame to the sovereignty of the void. You realize that the god is dead, but the religion is stronger than ever. You look at the ash falling like snow, knowing that you are finally the last soldier of a forgotten cause. The Golden Age is a flash in the dark, and you are the only eye left to watch the Helghan Empire burn.